Hi, thank you everyone for joining us on this webinar on immigrant detention issues. I'm Angela from the Global AAPI Caucus of Democrats Abroad based in Singapore and voting in California, talking with civil rights attorney Eunice Cho based in Washington, DC. First of all, this online event is a joint presentation from the AAPI, Hispanic, and Veterans and Military Families Caucuses, which are all represented by the members in this virtual audience. So thank you for being a part of this. Immigration issues affect each of our caucuses communities in extreme and surprising ways. Really quick, the so-called unauthorized population comes in at about 11 million individuals, but that's 2019 numbers per the Migration Policy Institute. They're different numbers, which with different research centers, but that is almost a quarter of the total foreign-born population in the US, which is numbering about 45.6 million. And hundreds, this is a terribly loose number, of US veterans have been deported, some due to someone's clerical error. That exact number is not known, which is obviously additionally troubling. And while Mexico is currently the country of origin of the highest number of this unauthorized population in the US, it's also the origin of the highest number of eligible candidates for citizenship who hesitate to naturalize due to language and financial barriers, amongst other reasons, according to Pew. And lastly, my last little factoid, 15% of this unauthorized population are from Asian countries. That's about 1.7 million. And again, these are numbers just based on the data available. And we can imagine the numbers in reality are greater. So there is a lot we could discuss with Eunice, with anybody regarding US immigration issues, such as border screening, citizenship roadmaps, asylumship, transnational adoption. We only have an hour, so we will mostly focus on immigrant detention. Eunice has kindly given us this time, and she is currently a staff attorney at the ACLU National Prison Project, but she's appearing exclusively in her individual capacity here with us today. And she's also worked with the Southern Poverty Law Center and the National Employment Law Project. Eunice actively works to challenge unconstitutional conditions in US immigration detention facilities and to challenge the expansion of immigration detention. And so just a reminder, this session, if you need to step out early, it will be recorded and posted for viewing later on the Democrats Abroad webpage. So shall we jump right in?
Sure. Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, evening, wherever you are today.
Oh yeah, we're all over. For being here and giving us this slice of your weekday morning. And you know this already, but the reason I contacted you and wanted to bring you into this discussion was I remembered that a few years ago, I and the greater public, we were made aware via spontaneous detention center inspections, like photos of chain link cages crammed with children. There was disturbing video footage of detained infants being reunited with their parents and not recognizing them. General stats of detention center deaths and like medical neglect. Then the election lead up and pandemic overtook the public conscious. We've been distracted. And over the past year, I had been thinking, well, obviously, you know, those facilities are still there, those issues are still there. There's a little coverage on how COVID has been spreading in the facilities, but that's when I reached out to you because I know there's so much I and we just don't know and need to be made known. So can you, this is a big question, can you catch us up on some key points or events regarding the US's immigrant detention program from the past 1 year, like the who, the why, and the how?
Sure. Well, again, thank you so much for inviting me to join you this morning. It's great to see you, Angela. I'm so glad to be able to have this opportunity to talk about immigration detention in the United States. Some facts just at our fingertips. Currently, there are about 200 detention centers nationwide, all around the United States. Currently, you know, as of ICE's detention statistics, probably in the last week, ICE is holding approximately 21,000 people in these detention facilities each day. That doesn't include the approximately 15,000 children that are being held in detention facilities operated by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. But total, these are only daily statistics. So, in the last fiscal year, the government detained over almost 180,000 people in detention. So 180,000 people have been locked up in 1 year alone. And these statistics are actually lower than in past years, partially due to litigation and orders stating that the government should keep these numbers lower given the COVID-19 pandemic and the spread of COVID-19 in congregate settings, which include detention facilities, but also the Biden administration's policies largely barring people from Mexico and Central America from entering the United States due to Title 42 and other policies holding asylum seekers at the border. So for a lot of these reasons, the detention numbers have gone down, but they still remain quite high and still are endangering people who are in those detention facilities. One thing that we saw, especially during the Trump administration, was, of course, as these horrific pictures of what was happening in detention. And for people who work on these issues, for advocates, it was an interesting moment because these had been conditions that had been going on for years under prior administrations as well. But suddenly, especially because of the combination of some of the more very brutal policies, such as family separation, that the Trump administration had implemented, immigration detention really broke into the public consciousness in a new way. And I think the question is, the legacy of that and what is currently happening is still with us. In the past 4 years, ICE anchored the growth of detention centers. So the Trump administration actually added about 25, the detention facility system grew by 50% during that time, and anchored these new detention centers, built about 40 new detention facilities in places where immigrants are the most likely to be isolated from counsel, and in jurisdictions where people really have no chance for release from these detention facilities. In places like Texas and Louisiana are largely focused in those states. So we saw the numbers of people the number of beds almost grow exponentially in states like Louisiana and Texas, where detention facilities had not really existed in that scale before. And also, this growth was largely anchored by private prison corporations. So today, approximately 80% of people who are detained in immigration detention are held in facilities that are owned or operated by private prison companies like GEO or CoreCivic, who are paid billions of dollars a year to lock people up in detention. And I guess the other question that we often get is, who are people who are in detention? And so often, they are usually non-citizens, although there have been recent cases talking about how citizens, particularly people of color, who ICE officials see as foreign, are also locked up and swept in these detention facilities. But statutorily, these are non-citizens. They can be documented or undocumented immigrants, including people whose immigration status is not current, may have been expired, or is under review. And the US locks up survivors of torture, people who are seeking asylum, visa holders, people who have been granted green cards, folks who've lived in the United States for years and might have American citizens, spouses, and children's, people with mental health and medical conditions, and other vulnerable groups, including pregnant women and families with children, even babies, in immigration detention. The Biden administration has tried to address some of this, so there have been recent policies around review of detention of people who are pregnant, for example. But underlying framework for who can be held in detention is still largely the same.
That is, that's a lot. I mean, there's so many little questions that I have for you from just what you shared with us. And one is, you were mentioning family separation and pregnant women, and I'm just wondering what the long-term issues, I suppose, are for the victims of these immigrant detention centers, because you're mentioning in the Trump administration that the detention centers were sort of blooming. Like, I had read that there used to be like a 20-day cap on how long people could be kept in an immigration detention center, and that cap was it was augmented sometime over the last few years to allow more people to stay in detention centers longer, basically. I don't know what the parameters were for that 20-day cap, but just that there's more people who are staying longer. And it's obviously more than just a mental health issue, it's a human rights issue. But I'm thinking of these distraught children and the video footage that I mentioned before. What can you tell us about these long-term issues, regardless
Sure.
of the outcome of these cases?
Yeah, well, the 20-day cap that you mentioned is supposed to be a limit for how long children can be held in detention facilities. There's a long-standing injunction against the government that says that children cannot be held in custody longer for 20 days. Unless there's no sponsor or other alternative placement available for them. However, adults, anyone over the age of 18 really can be held. And there are certainly cases of people who have been held for multiple years as their immigration cases kind of wind through the system. In terms of, I see a question about, violence against women and children in detention centers, sexual violence, forced sterilization. So, of course, many people have heard about, the allegations that were made in particular at Irwin Detention Center in Georgia, where I worked for several years. Regarding, unwanted gynecological procedures, conducted against women held in custody. Since then, the Biden administration has shut that particular facility down. But what happened in the wake of that, of course, is we saw that ICE was trying to deport many of the women who had actually suffered these involuntary medical procedures, to basically trying to destroy the evidence. This happens quite frequently, only with the intervention of several members of Congress and advocates were some of these women able to stay in the country to pursue their claims. However, I think what the Irwin detention facility really taught us is that these types of abuses, especially, involuntary medical treatment, the vulnerability that people in detention face, especially given their health, is a continuing problem. And, one can look at, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic and the way that ICE handled the pandemic in detention. Last year was the highest number of people who have died in custody in 15 years. And, I participated in several lawsuits against ICE regarding the management of COVID-19 in detention facilities. And, what was uncovered in the course of these lawsuits was, frankly, a horrifying pattern of neglect and failure to protect people from COVID-19 in custody. We saw people begging for soap, begging for face masks. In one case, in San Diego, for example, the private prison company was, we're telling people in detention that they must sign a liability waiver in order to receive face masks at first, where there were, people were being denied tests, even if they were exposed to people who were, clearly symptomatic for COVID-19. These were patterns, when vaccines first became available, ICE had no plan or protocol to distribute vaccines to people in ICE detention. So, this is kind of just a larger pattern of medical neglect and the lack of proper healthcare that's provided to people in detention. And remember, these are people who are held in custody and have basically every minute of their lives is now governed by guards. And so the necessary protections that people have to take from COVID-19, including people who are medically vulnerable to COVID-19, was really going, very mismanaged by ICE at that point.
That was going to be one of my questions, just how COVID had impacted, life for these victims in the detention centers, because you would think that in these crowded conditions, there would hopefully be more prevention methods. I remember there was an outbreak in one detention facility that occurred because one of the guards actually contracted the virus and then brought it into the facility. And I mean, obviously nobody gets the virus on purpose, but it's just unfortunate that, there are things that we know that we can do to protect each other. And a detention center, as crowded as these are a place where a virus would really thrive. Speaking of like medical neglect, I was also hearing about how there's a huge female population, of course, in these detention centers, and there aren't really resources for like feminine hygiene products or new mothers and infant care. And what can we do about that? I mean, not just as voters, but just as human people. I mean, what can anybody do about that, really?
Well, I think the first question is, why is ICE actually detaining people in the first place? I mean, why is ICE detaining children and babies and nursing mothers? And if that is actually happening, I think the question is, why does the government feel that it is so necessary to hold especially vulnerable people behind bars while they're awaiting civil immigration detention proceedings? I mean, this really is a question as to, allocation of resources and whether or not we really should be spending billions of dollars a year locking people up in detention facilities. I think what people forget is that immigration detention is a system that is relatively new. This is not something that, has always been with us. In fact, you look back in 20 years ago and the numbers of people being detained were much lower. In 1996, for example, there were 6,000 people being held in detention facilities per day. And it's now, at the peak of detention under the Trump administration, that had grown to 50,000 people per day. Right now, again, it's about 21,000. But, there is really no need for the government to have this sprawling mass incarceration system for people who are basically awaiting civil immigration proceedings, to figure out whether or not they can or cannot stay in the United States. And when you think about the fact that so many of these people are, have families or community members who are willing to take them in and may even own their homes with their own families and are in danger of losing them because they're in detention and unable to work. It really is a question as to why the government has made this decision that is so counter to the health and welfare of families and communities, especially given the lengthy time that it takes to process immigration cases, generally speaking. So what we're seeing is, of course, lives that are upended, not only the lives of people who are in detention, but the lives of their family members and community members who are suffering because of the existence of these detention centers in the first place.
Is it an overgeneralization of me to say that what indeed is driving the creation and filling of these detention centers, many of these being privately held, and I think for profit is the term that I saw describing some of them, it is profit, right? It's not even to fulfill some other policy aim, but to, I guess, line pockets, I mean, to put it sort of crudely. Can you tell me about the, I guess, alternatives to detention that kind of get bandied about, like supervised release, unsupervised release, or what other terms should we know about what the actual alternatives are?
Right. I think that there have been, a lot of great proposals and a lot of great examples as to alternatives to detention. The government really discusses detention as a way to meet two goals. One is, to prevent flight and to prevent danger from the community. And flight is really kind of ensuring that people show up at their immigration proceedings, and the danger to the community is looking at, weighing public safety harms, if somebody is released from custody. And I think it's really important to see how the government has really been using those standards in an abusive manner. So usually, we can look at, for example, how like bond hearings or adjudication proceedings really work sometimes. The government can say, oh, we believe that this person poses a flight risk or a danger to the community, and then will require the person who's in detention, often who may not have money to, and certainly doesn't have the guaranteed right to a government provided lawyer, in a very short amount of time to provide, a lot of information that tries to counter what the government is saying. And often doesn't just have the tools or the sophisticated, resources to be able to push back against the government argument. And it becomes a de facto kind of claim that the government can repeat in thousands of cases. And because the burden rests with the at least in many cases right now, with the detained person to kind of prove that they're not going to be a flight risk or danger to the community, they often lose, and then they're stuck in detention. But what many of these alternatives to detention really talk about are, providing, check-ins, to the government, providing support resources to make sure that people have, an understanding of the legal process so that they will show up, and understand the consequences of not showing up to their immigration detention proceeding, immigration adjudication proceedings. And what many studies have found is that it's incredibly cost effective to do this. That the vast majority, over 95% of people who are engaged in these types of community run, alternatives to detention will show up for their hearings, and at much less cost and much less disruption to family and community members. So this is something that has been proven to work, and is a model that advocates have been encouraging the administration to adopt instead of engaging in detention. The one thing on alternatives to detention to note is that, sometimes the government will state that, putting people on what are called, what we call ankle shackles or electronic ankle monitors. They're basically machines that you have to have basically strapped onto your ankle at all times, when you're sleeping, when you're in the shower. And it's basically a surveillance tracking device that notifies the government as to your precise location. And one can imagine the concerns that come with that. People have talked about how the government can listen in on what you're doing at any time. And so, some women have said, I'm sleeping, I'll hear it, I'll hear the officers kind of talking in the background and listening in on what I'm doing. People who are nursing their children or what other, types of scenarios in your home. And it is quite an invasion of privacy that I think there are certainly less invasive and less other methods that can be used to achieve the government's interest, which is making sure that people show up at their hearings.
As you've been detailing these, alternatives, it brings me back to the statement that you made earlier, which is what should really be examined is, the detention center system or even alternatives. It's why they're even there, what these policies are that even get an individual considered for this sort of monitoring, whatever form it is. Mm-hmm. Which brings me to, the question that I think we all have here that Onelika from our Hispanic Caucus has put so well, so I'm just going to read it for you. as Americans living abroad, amongst 2.9 million eligible US voters living abroad. We know it's critical to contact our elected officials back home to let them know how disgusted we feel about non-transparent private prisons holding immigrants, the abusive procedures that we talked about by ICE employees, this lack of urgency in humanely treating all detainees, including offering COVID vaccinations to them, and processing these cases in a somewhat timely manner. And generally, we know we have a civic responsibility in requesting an absentee ballot and voting as early as possible. And we also know that President Biden has made some advances in his initial campaign promises on immigration. But can you further specify how we as individuals can help fulfill the president's goals? How best we can stay actively informed? Really action items.
Sure.
Again, tackling this large issue.
Right. Well, I think as voters, I think it's important, you know, of course, you are still represented by members of Congress. And so, you know, I think key decision makers here, of course, are members of Congress as well as the executive. So the president and the Department of Homeland Security and ICE. There are many action items at this point with respect to immigration and immigration detention. Of course, currently in Congress, the Build Back Better bill has a number of provisions that could at least protect many undocumented people from deportation and provide eligibility to work and perhaps travel. Those are, of course, before the Congress at this point, and that would certainly protect millions of people who are living in the United States from, you know, the threat of detention and deportation in the first instance. So certainly those types of measures are things to continue to reach out to members of Congress and to underscore the importance of including and maintaining those provisions in congressional packages that are up for negotiation at this point. You know, that I think is certainly something that is very front burner and happening at the moment. In terms of larger term campaigns and issues around immigration detention, there are certainly, you know, there's certainly a push with the Department of Homeland Security, for example, to encourage shutting down, you know, detention facilities, really shrinking the detention footprint and making sure that these detention facilities, especially those that are so remote, that are so far away from urban centers. I mean, a lot of these detention centers, for example, are located literally 3 or 4 hours away from the nearest city. And so you can imagine not only the difficulty of finding immigration lawyers, you know, getting medical care and being in touch with family members, for example, how challenging that is if you're located in a detention facility that is so remote. And, you know, you know, there are many petitions, for example, that are targeted at Secretary Mayorkas, DHS Secretary Mayorkas, to shut down these facilities and so forth. The other thing that I think is very important to remember is that every year Congress has an appropriations bill, which is the amount of money that an agency is given to spend on certain provisions. And every year the Congress debates how much money should be given to ICE for detention facilities in general. And one thing that advocates have been pushing repeatedly is to shrink the amount of money that is given to ICE to fund these detention facilities. So being in touch with your members of Congress to really underscore the importance of those types of provisions, I think will be very helpful. In terms of staying actively informed and who and how you can kind of be in touch. Of course, I'm not speaking here as a representative of the ACLU. I'm here in my individual capacity only, but the ACLU does have you know, regular updates and action items for people who are concerned about immigration detention, as well as a host of other civil liberties issues. And so there is currently a petition about these issues online. The other organizations that work on immigration detention issues include the National Immigrant Justice Center, the Detention Watch Network. I'm a former board member of that organization that brings together grassroots groups all over the country working on detention issues for people in immigration detention. So those are some great organizations to follow and to kind of be actively involved in these issues.
I thank you. I can't wait to look at the recording of this session to like note down all the resources to pay attention to and to sort of keep updated with, because like I said, there's just a lot of, competing news and information. And I mean, to put it tritely, like until we're all free, no one is free. Mm-hmm. And there's just such a big segment of this population that is not free in this country that we love, that was founded by immigrants. That's the ultimate irony of this entire situation. You kind of sort of answered a question that was posted in the chat, which was what is the impact of the location of the detention centers on the ability of those detained to access legal, medical, and other resources they need? And is there support available for people with disabilities? And, as you said, it's kind of like the detention centers are setting people up to fail. I mean, it's created for the, not just profit, but I suppose for the convenience of the individuals in authority of these detention centers to have them, as you said, like 3 or 4 hours away from urban centers for a sort of indefinite detention. It's like the purpose is not just to detain, but to just entrap, I suppose. But is there anything more that you could share of, and even anecdotal information?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, on the question of support, for people with disabilities, I mean, I think, my experience working in detention has really shown that that is a particularly alarming problem and alarming crisis for people who are who have disabilities in detention, whether they're physical disabilities, mental disabilities, or invisible disabilities. I think detention is a dangerous place for anybody, but in particular for people with disabilities. I think about a client that I had even before the pandemic in 2019, we were doing basically a visit and a tour of the Wynn County detention facilities in Winfield, Louisiana, which is again about 4 hours away from the closest city, New Orleans. It is a long drive. And it is, basically this detention center is a former prison that, beds had been emptied out because, Louisiana, of course, is one of the places with the highest incarceration rates, not only in the United States, but in the entire world. And so, there have been some efforts at sentencing reform in the state of Louisiana to really bring down the number of people, mostly people of color who are locked up in these prisons and jails across the state. And as these jails and prisons began to basically empty out because of sentencing reform, sheriffs and the private prison companies that run these prisons turned to ICE for new business, and the Trump administration delivered. And of course, in Louisiana, signed up thousands of new beds for immigration detention. And I met my client, Mr. Amaya Portillo. He was an asylum seeker from Honduras. He had very visible physical disabilities. He was born with one leg that was half the length of the other. And you had 6 fingers on each hand. So these were obvious physical disabilities and differences that then, led him to lead a very, very difficult life because he was marked with such stigma. And he came to the United States seeking asylum because of the government Honduran government's inability to protect him from harassment and abuse as a result of his physical disability. What happened, of course, when he got to the United States was another nightmare. And, he came into detention and he described conditions where he was denied the use of a wheelchair. He couldn't, for example, bathe or use the bathrooms in the detention facility because of his height. And he had to depend on other people who were detained to help him out, to lift him onto the toilet or to help reach the shower handles. And it was really, and took so long for him to walk from place to place that he wasn't able to actually go to the cafeteria and get meals. So this was obviously a very, very difficult experience for him. What got worse, of course, was that apparently there was an inspection by government contractors who were contracted to inspect the facility. And on the day of the inspection, the inspectors were coming through and asking questions of people. And he, for some reason, was unexpectedly taken to the medical clinic, given a sleeping pill, and the door was locked. So he couldn't come out for the entire time of the inspection, which of course raises a lot of questions as to why that happened and why he was summarily disappeared from the inspectors. We visited the facility shortly thereafter and met with him, and he described this situation to us. We then wrote a letter to the facility and to ICE raising concerns with them, and then asked them to preserve any videotape of the surveillance videos that were taken during that time. And only a few days later, we received a panicked phone call from him saying that he was being put on a bus to the deportation station so that he'd be sent back to Honduras. What we then, of course, went into overdrive. We got an attorney to get him to sign a form that would allow us to share his information with the press and with members of Congress. And so we started reaching out to the Senate and House Judiciary Committees, headquarters at DHS, ICE, and basically threatened that there could be serious legal repercustions if ICE chose to deport him very quickly. And thankfully, it seemed to work. So on the 4-hour bus ride from his detention facility to the deportation staging area in Alexandria, we got a call saying that he was then going to be transferred to another detention facility in Louisiana. So he averted deportation. He was then released because it was very clear that the government had violated the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act in the way that he was treated in detention. He's now living with his family in New Jersey and is slated for an asylum hearing in the next few years. He's being represented by a pro bono attorney. But of course, this is an exceptional case. We happen to be there, and that certainly is not the case for the many other people with disabilities and immigration detention. And we are hoping, of course, that the Biden administration will take a better approach to the treatment of people who are vulnerable in detention. So not only people with physical disabilities, but those who are vulnerable to the spread of COVID-19, those are people with disabilities under the statutory definition, and taking a much more robust and protective stance against people who have disabilities in detention, generally speaking.
I just can't believe this is, the story of Mr. Portillo is from, and it's someone who's seeking asylum, there's so many different reasons that people come here, whether it's like overstaying their visa, and there's just so many, I suppose you could say, genesis of this roadmap to citizenship. But for him, he's just seeking relief. But I am glad to hear that he, for now, is in safety and with family. Thank you for sharing that really meaningful anecdote.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what you work on with the ACLU National Prison Project.
Sure. Yes, and again, just noting that I'm here in my individual capacity, as this is a partisan event, but my work at the National Prison Project, I'm a staff attorney working on primarily immigration detention issues. So we look at, protecting people who are suffering from unconstitutional conditions of confinement, and also working to release as many people who are facing unconstitutional conditions of confinement, and addressing kind of the expansion of immigration detention in the United States. So looking at how the government has really built up this immigration detention system nationwide. In the last year and a half, of course, we have all been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, this has, as we've discussed earlier, really affected people in custody in immigration detention. And what we've seen, of course, is tens of thousands of people who have been infected with COVID-19 in, excuse me, in ICE detention. These are cases that are have included people who are medically vulnerable to COVID-19, have preconditions and pre-existing health conditions that place them at further risk of very serious illness or death from COVID-19. And of course, the ACLU filed over 40 lawsuits at detention centers nationwide to release people from detention, especially those who are medically vulnerable. And of course, the things that we've seen over the past year and a half have been shocking. As I noted earlier, at first the government had no protocol whatsoever to really address the risks of COVID-19, and once it began to bring together a policy, those protocols were not being followed at detention centers nationwide. We saw, rampant outbreaks. We saw, for example, the government transferring people from detention facilities that had active outbreaks of COVID-19 to other detention facilities in other states, then sparking new outbreaks in those facilities. And of course, it's really important to realize that a detention center is not just it's not a bubble. It is a part of a broader community. And so people who work in these detention facilities are able to bring COVID-19 in and out between facilities. And of course, the government has not given us statistics as to the number of guards, for example, who contracted or even died from COVID-19 as a result of their work in detention facilities. But, from media reports, we are aware of several cases. And of course, those are the ones that have been reported. We do not know of other cases. But I mean, we've heard stories, like the one where I told you about the government of detention facilities, requiring people to sign liability waivers before they get masks, or, the failure of the provision of vaccines to detention facilities nationwide, saying, it was the detention facilities' responsibility to kind of find their own vaccines to vaccinate people, even though these are people in federal custody. The Trump administration somewhat famously transferred, if one can remember the Black Lives Matter protests that were happening last September or in August in Washington, D.C., where President Trump famously held up a Bible in front of the church in Washington, D.C., across the street from the White House, amidst protesters. Well, the backstory that kind of connects to immigration detention there, of course, is that ICE, the Department of Homeland Security, justified its transport of National Guard troops to bring to Washington, D.C. for crowd control purposes by claiming that ICE needed to transfer ICE detainees from one detention center to another one in local Virginia. And what happened as a result of that transfer, of course, was the spread of COVID-19 from detention centers in Arizona to Virginia, which then directly led to the death of an 80-year-old immigrant detainee from Canada who was held at the Farmville, Virginia Detention Center. So you see these narratives just really interweaving with one another, and just the harm that some of these very misguided policy decisions had on people directly.
And like you said, like, you know, the evidence and statistics that you have are just what's reported, right? And it's just harrowing to think about what is either not reported on purpose or just not detected, you know, the dots are not connected. So, I mean, I'm just flummoxed by, you know, some of the data points that you've given us today, but it leads me to a somewhat more personal question, which is what brought you to this line of work? I mean, you've kind of had like a 20-year career with immigrant advocacy, essentially. Is that correct?
Yes. So, I mean, you know, I'm the daughter of immigrants, and you know, also grew up in Arizona, which I think unfortunately has a reputation for having some of the country's most aggressive anti-immigrant policies. And of course, this was something that we lived and breathed. You know, I do remember having kids in my class disappear because they had been deported. So, you know, as a kid, it was jarring to kind of see kids who were in class one day and would not be in class the next. So, and you know, to realize that it was really because of our citizenship status, right? The arbitrary question of where one was born and what legal rights you had really determined your future and whether you would get to stay in your home or not. So I think that was something that was very kind of apparent to me as a kid. And of course, I watched my parents, you know, deal with anti-immigrant harassment and racism. This is, of course, something that is unfortunately continuing trope today, especially given, you know, some of the animus that people have faced in the wake of COVID-19. And so, you know, I think really understanding why that happened was such an important part of my kind of experiences as a kid, that I went on to study these issues in college, and then went on to become a community organizer in immigrant communities before I went to law school. And so when I was in law school, I had the fortune to work at several nonprofit organizations that worked either directly or indirectly with people in detention. And I think, you know, the experience, you know, I worked at the Florence Immigrant and Refugee Rights Project in Arizona, which, you know, was an hour away from where I grew up. And it was quite a jarring sight to spend the summer in a town that is basically a prison town where 75% of people in the town are incarcerated or detained, locked up behind bars, and where the other 25% seem to somehow be employed in their detention or incarceration in one means or another. And, you know, I can describe what this town looks like. It's a town in the middle of the desert. It's a dusty road that is surrounded. You go down the freeway and you see barbed wire all around you with humongous prisons and detention centers that are filled with thousands of people surrounded by barbed wire. And the entire town has basically been converted into a prison town. You know, walking in and out every day of these detention facilities and talking to people who were, you know, trying to fight their cases to be reunited with their families and to live a life in the United States, and just the tremendous odds that people face and the mistreatment that people face because they are non-citizens and they're being detained, I think it left a very strong mark on me, and became kind of what I felt was really important to do in terms of my work. And so, you know, I think the thing about immigration detention is that so few people know about it, and that it really has disappeared from sight, especially given the way that the government has chosen to locate these detention facilities so far away from urban centers. You know, even for people who have family in detention, it's so difficult to go and visit them. And so it has really disappeared from public view. And I do think that it's very important for us all to remember and to know about this system because of the fact that, I think at the end of the day, we really have to question why it exists in the first place and whether or not it really is the best decision for us to be holding and locking people up while they're simply trying to fight their immigration cases.
It is really striking me how this sort of unseen population is indeed swept under the rug, made unseen on purpose. I have one last, I guess, well, it's personal, but immigration related question for you before I wrap up, which is, do you have any other further recommended reading or media for consumption, like nonfiction, even fiction, podcasts, or just a really organized website, e-newsletter that you favor? How can we keep this issue in our minds and hearts? Because it is so easy to be distracted from it.
Well, that's a great question. Just personally speaking, in my off time, I try not to actually read too much about immigration because it can then. So I might have to ask you, like, what are great TV shows to watch in your downtime? But in terms of great books, great media. I think of course, I follow again, I am speaking only in my personal capacity, but I follow on social media, I follow the ACLU, the Detention Watch Network, Instagram and Twitter feeds. I think those are very helpful to find. In terms of longer reads, there's some great books. One foundational book I've always found to be particularly fascinating is an author called May Ngai, Ngai, who is a professor at Columbia University. She has recently written a book called The Chinese Question about the history of Chinese migration to not only the United States, but globally. But she has written several other books about immigration, including kind of the fictions of immigration enforcement. Other books include authors like Cesar Cuauhtemoc Garcia, who's written about crimmigration. I follow his blog. The Immigration Professor Law blog is also very interesting for at least for people who are interested in following those types of questions. And I think there have been several, there's a new film that's coming out next week by Seth Fried Wessler. He's a journalist, and he is coming out with a new film actually about the Irwin Detention Center and the COVID-19 pandemic in the coming, I think this week. I'm just going to look this up on Twitter, but I think it will be available on streaming, and that should be something that everyone should watch, because I think it is actually very applicable to what is happening today. He's an investigative reporter for ProPublica. I will just, there's a link I will post in the chat for everybody about it.
Thank you. Okay, any other recs? If not, okay, I will then begin to wrap it up with our last few minutes. Eunice, thank you so much for your time, your words, your experience. This Washington, D.C. work morning, we are so grateful to make this connection with somebody with truly a heart for immigrant advocacy. Somebody who's on the front lines of this truly important issue in a country that we as Americans abroad love from afar. And also I, on behalf of the AAPI caucus, also want to thank the Global Veterans and Military Families Caucus and Hispanic caucuses for their support in co-presenting this event. Attendees, thank you for the time you've made to attend, to listen, to learn. If this webinar left you wanting to hear more, then we have done our job. But we would love to hear what further immigration related topics or questions we should tackle next. And you can, of course, find our contact information at democratsabroad.org. And lastly, this is just to any of our other attendees, please consider supporting Democrats Abroad. DA is only possible because of its worldwide network of amazing and generous volunteers. So Eunice, I leave you to your Washington, D.C. day, and happy holidays to you and to everybody. And I just want to say thank you again.
Thanks so much, Angela, and thanks to all of you at Democrats Abroad.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.